The absolute and irreversible cessation of our being is what we call death. A vast majority of individuals subconsciously push the thought of their own mortality deep into the recesses of their minds, finding the concept far too terrifying to confront head-on. Alternatively, there are those who dread the physical suffering that precedes passing away, or the agonizing loss of cherished friends and family, rather than the state of non-existence itself. Even though you and I navigate entirely distinct paths, filled with vastly different encounters, humanity is ultimately bound by a single, inescapable destiny. This ultimate conclusion is the great equalizer that connects every single one of us, offering a grim grin that we can only return with quiet acceptance. It is natural for you to view passing away as a deeply unwelcome prospect, primarily because it robs you of your ongoing earthly journey. Assuming this demise represents an eternal cessation of awareness without any spiritual continuation, analyzing this dread becomes crucial, even for individuals who champion the concept of life after death, since grasping immortality fundamentally requires comprehending mortality. Should we consider an absolute end to be inherently bad, it is strictly due to the fact that it abruptly terminates all the beautiful and positive experiences our existence has to offer. From this perspective, navigating through our daily struggles remains deeply valuable, suggesting that a longer span of years is inherently preferable to a shorter one. The essence of a meaningful existence is essentially constructed from every single element and pursuit that brings us joy and satisfaction. The true worth of your days is not merely tied to the biological continuation of your physical form. After all, most would equate an instantaneous demise with falling into a permanent coma that ultimately leads to the grave. Consequently, extending our time on Earth is only beneficial as long as we retain our awareness and possess the capacity to engage in rewarding encounters. When we label mortality as a negative occurrence, it is the deprivation of future possibilities that causes us grief, not the literal condition of being absent from reality. This unavoidable termination is tragic, purely because it strips away everything we hold dear, prompting a fascinating question about the potential consequences of endless longevity. Should you possess an infinite stretch of tomorrows, it is highly likely that such boundlessness would foster a profound, collective apathy. Stripped of any pressing need to accomplish significant milestones or cherish each passing moment, humanity could easily spiral into a state of profound dissatisfaction, proving that the very presence of a final curtain is exactly what gives our fleeting moments their immense worth. American philosopher Thomas Nagel highlights a pair of frequent psychological errors people commit when contemplating their own demise. The initial fallacy revolves around the stark contrast in how we view the nothingness following our passing versus the void that preceded our conception. Before you entered this world, you were entirely absent from reality, yet practically no one looks back on that pre-birth emptiness as a tragic deprivation. It prompts the question of why the darkness at the end of the tunnel is so dreaded, when the identical darkness at the beginning is completely ignored by our collective anxieties. Certain thinkers argue that dreading the inevitable end is illogical, because it merely reflects the infinite stretch of time before we arrived, though this reasoning collapses upon closer inspection. While it remains a fact that you are absent in both the era before your arrival and the epoch after your departure, the latter period represents a tangible theft of future years you otherwise could have experienced. Conversely, emerging into the world does not rob you of anything. The centuries leading up to your first breath were never yours to lose, effectively shattering the false equivalence between the two periods of non-existence. The second conceptual blunder centers on the very root of our mortality-related anxieties, frequently stemming from an erroneous attempt to envision the actual experience of being deceased. This flawed mental exercise breeds the terrifying illusion that the end is a dark, mystical realm waiting to envelop us, despite the logical impossibility of perceiving anything once all cognitive functions have permanently ceased. Individuals terrified by this prospect mistakenly treat non-existence as a form of awareness. While you can easily visualize your lifeless body from an external perspective, you can never actively participate in that condition. A profound philosophical hurdle arises when trying to pinpoint exactly who suffers this ultimate misfortune and at what specific moment the suffering occurs. The ancient thinker Epicurus profoundly noted that this termination is irrelevant to us, stating that, while we are present, our demise is absent, and the moment it arrives, we are completely gone. Because you can never simultaneously be alive and dead, there is never a precise instant where this tragedy actually afflicts you, making the physical agony leading up to your final breath a much more rational source of dread than the state of nothingness itself. Ernest Becker, the brilliant mind behind the book The Denial of Death, faced his own mortality when a colon cancer diagnosis claimed his life a mere 2 years later at the age of 49. Following his passing, he was honored with the Pulitzer Prize for this profound exploration of the human condition, an accolade that cemented his intellectual legacy on a global scale. Becker argues that you and I are thrust into a deeply intimidating universe, where our primary driving force is an ingrained biological urge to suppress our fundamental dread and firmly reject the terrifying reality of our own expiration. He elegantly captures this horror as the profound tragedy of blossoming from absolute nothingness into a complex being with a distinct identity, intense emotions, and a desperate thirst for existence, only to have it all inevitably extinguished. Because this paralyzing fear is too massive to bear, we subconsciously collaborate to bury it deep within our psyches, utilizing our constructed personalities as a primary shield against the agonizing realization of our own vulnerability. In our formative years, we absorb strength from the towering figures raising us, forging our distinct personas by mimicking the traits of these seemingly invincible guardians in a desperate, unspoken bid to secure our own immortality. This quest for an expanded self is what Becker terms a pursuit of cosmic significance, perfectly encapsulating the heartbreaking burden placed upon humanity's shoulders. You are driven by an agonizing need to validate your own existence as a fundamentally crucial element of the cosmos, compelling you to strive for heroism and leave an indelible mark to prove your supreme worth above all else. Ultimately, this relentless pursuit of legendary status stands as the core dilemma of our species, fusing our innate biological self-centeredness with a desperate craving for validation to produce a creature whose very survival hinges on feeling absolutely indispensable. To shield ourselves from the unpredictable nature of existence, you and I construct what is known as character armor, creating an illusion of total control and safety. Unfortunately, this psychological barricade comes with a tremendous cost, as genuine vitality slips through our fingers while we cower inside these self-constructed emotional fortresses. The profound paradox of human existence lies in our desperate yearning to escape the dread of obliteration. Yet, because the act of living triggers this very terror, we instinctively recoil from experiencing existence to its absolute fullest. To further insulate us from our inherent vulnerability, civilization constructs a secondary shield, an elaborate hero system designed to convince you that engaging in enduring pursuits grants a victory over mortality. By dedicating our energies to raising a family, amassing wealth, or authoring literature, we essentially manufacture a substitute form of eternal life for ourselves. Because the central mission of human existence revolves around achieving this heroic status to conquer our eventual demise, every society inevitably develops a complex, underlying symbolic framework that operates much like a hidden religion. Consequently, our individual quests for greatness often devolve into ideological battlegrounds, pitting one person's pursuit of eternal legacy directly against another's. It is a fundamental, deeply rooted narcissism that propels soldiers directly into the line of enemy fire, driven by a subconscious conviction of their own invincibility, while pitying the inevitable fate of their comrades. To counter this delusion, Ernest Becker strongly recommends that you actively meditate on your own mortality. Fostering a continuous recognition of our impending end dismantles our illusions and strips away our character armor, empowering us to intentionally stand firm amidst life's inherent terrors, a path that distinctly separates the existential hero from the ordinary individual. Rather than taking refuge in comforting fabrications, this heroic figure boldly confronts their own fragility and powerlessness head-on. By choosing to navigate life with an ever-present awareness of their ultimate demise, such a person faces a profound crossroads. They can either surrender to utter despair or boldly embrace a leap of faith. Humanity simply cannot tolerate its own insignificance without projecting it into a grander narrative of universal purpose. Nevertheless, acknowledging this desperate craving for heroic validation remains an incredibly bitter pill to swallow, prompting you to frequently mask this internal conflict by accumulating wealth, thereby quantifying your perceived value behind closed doors. Ultimately, the most crucial introspective challenge you will ever face is uncovering the hidden motivations behind your relentless pursuit of this heroic sensation. Conversely, the Stoic philosophers fundamentally rejected the notion that our inevitable end should be a source of paralyzing dread, viewing it instead as an entirely natural mechanism devoid of inherent terror. To reinforce this perspective, they routinely engaged in the practice of Memento Mori, ensuring they never forgot the universal certainty of their own passing. As Marcus Aurelius powerfully articulated, you should envision your existence as already concluded, treating whatever time remains as an unexpected bonus to be utilized with absolute integrity. In this light, the reality of dying actually serves as the catalyst for experiencing existence completely. For a rational person should not dread their final breath, but rather the tragedy of never having truly engaged with life in the first place. For these ancient thinkers, mortality was never a crippling source of anxiety, but simply another thread woven into the fabric of the natural world. The philosopher Epictetus perfectly captured this pragmatic attitude, noting that while his demise was certain, he would gladly eat his meal if it were time for lunch, leaving the business of dying for when its appointed hour finally struck. By treating every passing moment as a step closer to the end, you are liberated from taking anything for granted, enabling a profound immersion in the fleeting beauty of the present. This stark awareness also forces you to prioritize genuine substance over petty grievances. When you reflect on the fading legacies of history's most furious or famous figures, now reduced to mere dust and forgotten myths, the triviality of our most passionate, earthly desires becomes overwhelmingly apparent. Similarly, Friedrich Nietzsche championed an enthusiastic acceptance of our mortality, extensively promoting the revolutionary concept of the free death. He boldly argued that while humanity assigns great gravity to passing away, we have yet to elevate it to the status of a joyous festival, often perishing either prematurely or long past our prime. Nietzsche suggested that a truly fulfilled individual dictates the terms of their own departure, transforming their final moments into a victorious culmination that serves as both an inspiration and a sacred vow to those left behind. Ultimately, he believed, you must learn to orchestrate your demise so that it represents a triumphant completion of your journey, validating the very meaning and intentionality that fueled your existence. In stark opposition to this empowered departure, Nietzsche fiercely criticized those he labeled the preachers of death, individuals whose souls are seemingly corrupted from birth by an overwhelming exhaustion with existence. These melancholic figures are quick to interpret the sight of illness, advanced age, or a corpse as definitive proof that the human experience is inherently flawed and worthless. He vehemently rejected this pessimistic worldview, warning us against disturbing these metaphorical living coffins who actively seek out doctrines of renunciation and long for their own negation. For Nietzsche, such a cynical repudiation of vitality was a profound tragedy, illustrating how you can effectively become deceased long before your heart actually stops beating. By highlighting the existence of the living dead, those who shirk the heavy responsibilities of being through endless labor or complete disengagement, Nietzsche proved that spiritual decay can precede physical expiration. In stark contrast to these individuals, Socrates, the foundational figure of Western philosophy, perfectly exemplified the art of departing at precisely the correct moment. Following the pronouncement by the Oracle of Delphi that no man surpassed him in wisdom, he dedicated his days to illuminating the minds of his fellow citizens, anchored by the profound maxim, to know thyself. Even as he faced a fatal sentence at 70 years old, he maintained his legendary humility, famously asserting his own ignorance as the cornerstone of his vast intellect. Earning the moniker of the Athenian gadfly, he relentlessly interrogated his peers, systematically unraveling the logical fallacies hidden within their seemingly solid arguments. His entire life's work was a concerted effort to leverage rigorous critical reflection, forcing you and his contemporaries to radically reevaluate deeply entrenched customs and orthodoxies. Today, this relentless pursuit of truth through persistent inquiry is universally recognized and revered as the Socratic method. According to the accounts detailed within Plato's Apology, the Athenian court condemned Socrates to consume lethal hemlock, finding him guilty of corrupting the city's younger generation and disrespecting its recognized deities. During these legal proceedings, the philosopher delivered his legendary declaration, asserting that a life devoid of critical self-reflection holds no true value. Although the authorities presented him with the alternative of living out his days in banishment, he firmly rejected the offer. Consequently, he passed his final hours incarcerated, surrounded by loyal companions who desperately proposed a clandestine flight to freedom, a proposition he ultimately dismissed. As his life drew to a close, he uttered a deeply cryptic instruction, urging his friend Crito to ensure a rooster was sacrificed to Asclepius, the divine physician. Through this profound request, the dying sage was essentially expressing his gratitude to the deity for providing the ultimate remedy of mortality to cure the enduring malady of human existence. In the context of ancient Hellenic culture, the rooster acted as a powerful emblem of resurrection and the spiritual realm beyond, heralding the dawn of a fresh epoch and serving as a customary tribute to this specific divine healer. By calling upon the singular mythological figure celebrated for resurrecting the deceased, the philosopher implied that this entity had successfully liberated him and his disciples from the relentless delirium of the mortal condition. Consequently, he implored his associates to diligently cleanse their inner spirits, to practice empathetic service toward their fellow citizens, and to wholeheartedly commit themselves to the collective well-being of their society. Transitioning to modern psychological perspectives, Carl Jung argued fiercely that human beings must cultivate an equal preparedness for their eventual demise as they do for their daily existence. He posited that our passing holds the exact same psychological weight as our arrival into the world, functioning as an absolutely essential component of the broader human journey. From his vantage point as a physician, he actively worked to fortify a sense of eternal continuity within his elderly clientele, particularly when the looming shadow of mortality began to surface. When viewed through a properly calibrated psychological lens, he suggested that reaching the end of our days represents a primary objective rather than a mere termination, asserting that our biological trajectory shifts toward this ultimate conclusion the moment we cross the midpoint of our years. Because his entire theoretical framework rests heavily on the delicate balance of conflicting mental forces, he continuously emphasized the necessity of embracing this inherent friction rather than fleeing from it. To ignore the absolute certainty of our mortality is to dwell in a state of profound self-deception, directly opposing our most fundamental biological imperatives. Consequently, the pioneering psychoanalyst sharply condemned modern society's severe imbalance, noting how we obsessively celebrate youth and vitality while aggressively suppressing any acknowledgement of our inevitable end, ultimately urging you to actively lay the psychological groundwork for the latter portion of your journey. This inevitably raises a critical question regarding how you should confront your own mortality as the years advance. Jung observed that passing away becomes a matter of paramount concern for the elderly, presenting an unavoidable philosophical interrogation that demands a coherent response. To navigate this daunting transition, he advocated for the construction of a personal, mythological framework, primarily because pure logic offers nothing beyond the terrifying vision of an endless, consuming abyss. In stark contrast, symbolic narratives possess the unique capacity to generate constructive and nurturing visions of an existence continuing within the spiritual domain. Whether an individual fully embraces these metaphysical landscapes or merely entertains them, their factual accuracy remains entirely unprovable and functionally equivalent to the stance of a rigid skeptic. Yet, the crucial distinction lies in the emotional outcome. Whereas the hopeless individual plods miserably toward absolute oblivion, the person who anchors their trust in a timeless archetype seamlessly aligns with the natural flow of existence, carrying vitality directly into their final breath. While neither path offers empirical certainty, the latter harmonizes beautifully with our innate drives, whereas the former fundamentally violates them. Cultivating such a deeply personal narrative is not a product of cold intellectual design, but rather blossoms from a careful observation of your internal mental landscape, utilizing techniques like active imagination, dream analysis, and the recognition of profound synchronicities. This continuous, lifelong endeavor of individuation gradually drags buried psychological material into the light of awareness, ultimately decentralizing the ego in favor of a more comprehensive sense of self. The psychologist famously illustrated this concept by detailing the extraordinary hallucinations he endured following a catastrophic medical event that pushed him to the very brink of survival. Suspended in the cosmic void, he vividly perceived his own consciousness hovering at an immense altitude, gazing upon a colossal mass of floating granite, crowned by an ethereal sanctuary. As he drew nearer to the grand entrance of this structure, an astonishing revelation washed over him, convincing him that his very essence was composed entirely of his accumulated historical experiences. This profound realization simultaneously stripped away all his worldly attachments, leaving him utterly impoverished, yet overwhelmingly saturated with meaning, entirely devoid of earthly cravings, and existing purely as the sum total of the life he had previously navigated. Initially, a terrifying sensation of complete erasure and psychological looting dominated his awareness. But this dread rapidly evaporated into utter insignificance. Any lingering sorrow over lost possessions or severed connections vanished entirely, replaced by a triumphant recognition that he possessed the absolute entirety of his being, which proved to be infinitely sufficient. Moving closer to the sacred threshold, an unshakable confidence took hold of him, assuring him that he was on the verge of stepping into a radiant chamber to reunite with his true, eternal kindred spirits. Within that luminous space, he anticipated unlocking the ultimate mysteries of his existence, finally grasping the intricate historical tapestry his life was woven into, and understanding the fundamental purpose behind his earthly manifestation. Tragically, this transcendent journey was abruptly interrupted by a manifestation of his earthly physician, firmly instructing him to descend back to the mortal realm, immediately shattering the celestial illusion. Forced back into the restrictive confines of a physical body, everyday existence felt akin to a suffocating incarceration. While daylight hours dragged him into a deep melancholy, the nighttime offered rapturous episodes, granting him an intoxicating encounter with a divine fragrance and an indescribable spiritual presence that vividly embodied the mystical union of opposites. Drawing direct inspiration from these nocturnal revelations, the scholar titled his final monumental publication Mysterium Conjunctionis, finishing this exhaustive exploration of alchemical and psychological reconciliation during his 81st year of life. He ultimately declared that this specific manuscript permanently anchored his entire theoretical system into an unshakable reality, securing its historical legacy and signaling the definitive completion of his life's mission. Upon reaching this intellectual summit, he acknowledged that he had pushed his scientific inquiries to their absolute maximum threshold, brushing against the ineffable core of the archetype itself, a realm where empirical language completely fails to capture the profound mysteries lying beyond. Reflecting upon these near-death episodes long after he had recovered, he maintained that human language remained entirely inadequate to articulate the magnificent splendor and raw emotional power of those cosmic encounters. He fiercely defended their authenticity, categorizing them as the most monumental events of your entire existence, and adamantly refusing to dismiss them as mere fabrications of a fevered brain. To him, these transcendent voyages lacked any trace of personal bias, radiating an aura of undeniable, absolute objectivity that permanently altered his comprehension of the universe.